Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the INACOL Leadership Webinar. This is Susan Patrick. I'm the president of INACOL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll be looking in the chat box on the lower left-hand of your screen. You can type in questions during the webinar. Please feel free to use this chat box to introduce yourself, where you're from, and to ask any questions or make comments. We're hoping to have an interactive webinar today. We'll also send you a follow-up after the webinar with links for the archived webinar so you can refer back at any time to today's discussion. To get kicked off, I just want to point out that leadership is such an important topic today in the context of this rapidly changing world. Around the globe, we're seeing K-12 education transforming learning using new models that are more learner-centered, next-gen models using personalized learning and competency-based pathways. It's on everyone's mind. What does this mean for leadership? And what does this mean for leadership leading transformation? Today's webinar is going to highlight an excellent report just released by the National Center for Innovation and Education titled Leadership for Learning. What is leadership's role in supporting success for every student? We'll put a link to the report in the chat box. The report was written by our three presenters today: Jean Wilhoit, the CEO for the National Center for Innovation and Education; Linda Pittenger from the National Center for Innovation and Education; and Jim Rickabaugh, the Senior Advisor at the Institute for Personalized Learning. The ideas in the report and paper are comprehensive, well-framed, and influential. I found the paper incredible when I read it. It's such a great resource for education leaders advancing next-generation learning models. And ultimately, we want to think about how this paper can help leadership in the field, how you can engage in conversations in your own work. So the paper outlines a new learning agenda, defines key dimensions of leadership for systems change, and addresses the enabling conditions for transforming communities towards a future state of education. I'd like to start by turning the webinar over to Jean Wilhoit, and thank you so much for joining us today, Jean.
Thank you, Susan, and we appreciate the opportunity to interact with INACOL leadership across the country. I find the organization to be one of the more exciting ones in terms of bringing about the kinds of changes that we're going to need in the next years, and I do appreciate the hard work that so many people are carrying out within INACOL. Jim Rickabaugh and I are going to this afternoon try to present some ideas in short, and we would encourage you to either respond on the chat box or hold those until after a short presentation, because we want to spend the majority of time wrestling with some of these issues and thinking about the implications of the report to your context. So we'll run through a few slides, but we want to hold this to a fairly short time frame and then get us engaged in a deep conversation. As Susan referenced, we hope all of you have been able to access the report, Leadership for Learning. First, I guess the question most of you would ask is, why do we do this? And I think what we have seen, as Susan noted earlier, is a number of innovative sites emerging across the country where people are beginning to realize, practitioners, teachers, administrators, that we need a new way of doing business. But as we looked at the kind of advice that's being given and the support that's being given to the leaders, we saw too much, sort of like the old adage, if we say that louder, they will improve. And what we're really concerned about is that so much of the guidance that's been given in preparation and support programs to leaders is that this idea of let's just incrementally improve what we have been doing, or let's simply add more predictability to the system, more guidance, more courses, more time, etc. And really, for us, that seems to be foolhardy in thinking, because we have inherited a much more complex world that is changing much more rapidly than any time in our history. And all of these outside forces around demographics, around globalization, around technological developments are dramatically impacting the world around us, and yet too many people in education are sort of trying to fix what we inherited. And that legacy system, it doesn't fit with what we're now charged to learn as students and adults. It doesn't fit how we learn, and it doesn't fit the sort of sequence of learning that we've inherited. And so it's obvious to us that these new demands and the challenges are really out of alignment with the old system that we've inherited. And so that's why we used in this paper the words transformational. But these shifts are so critical. In the world around us, some people have ignored them to their peril. Some people have made adjustments and are moving forward, and some new entities are emerging in the world that we didn't even envision in the past and are thriving in this kind of new environment. We think those are dramatic lessons for educators. So we think there are new definitions that are emerging around college and career and civic expectations that we're going to have to be responsible to. We have adopted virtually across this country new, better aligned expectations. Some use the phrase deeper learning, but it's this combination of new knowledge, new skills, and new dispositions, whatever one titles that are going to be necessary for success at college, careers, and civic life. We've also begun to sense that there are new learner expectations within that system. So when you marry higher expectations with this need for personalization of learning, then the old system simply does seem to be out of alignment. So for us, incremental is not enough. Fixing the old system is not enough. We need to begin to think about this issue. So the challenges of meeting these new high expectations, which are important to meet, and this idea of personalizing learning, those two are extreme challenges. But the other challenge we've added to the education system in this is it's not just for a few. And the fabricated system that we have inherited is no longer tolerable to the policymakers, to the public, to the parents. So now we are about the business of educating all to these expectations. So it is becoming a very important and difficult yet exciting kind of challenge for the world. So that's why now we think this pressure on us to begin to look at leadership in a very different way than we have in the past. Jim, any comments on that area?
I
We lost Jim?
hear you.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. Gina, I think you're absolutely right. That this is a time when we cannot afford not to act. In fact, as I think about just the title of this slide, the why now, why has been out there for quite a while. We have known there was a need to change. Now it has become urgent and it's become critical. In fact, just thinking about, as I was listening to you, a couple things came to mind. One is the system we have was designed for an industrial era, industrial economy, and it worked really well for that. And as we moved into a knowledge era, a knowledge economy, we tried to do what we could to sort of torque and shift the system around in order to have it work for us. And it did not give us all that we needed. But now, as we enter sort of this next era, the era of or economy that's based on innovation and learning, there's very little in the original design that prepares us for that. So if we think about, and we address this in the paper, the futures for which we're trying to prepare today's learners, you know, a good portion of them are going to be working in jobs that don't even exist today, requiring skills that have yet to be defined in a world that's going to be rapidly changing and unpredictable. So that's a very different challenge than we've had in the past. So to your point, what we need is a new design, not more pressure, not more accountability, not more blame, not more shame. We need a new approach. And so the paper itself is really written for, not for leaders who just want to reduce the variance in the system they have, or that want to make incremental improvement, as you point out, Gene. This is really for people who are saying, look, let's get serious about providing opportunities for all learners that meet their needs, that prepare them for their future. Not our future, not their parents' future, not their grandparents' future, but their future. So it is an urgent. From that perspective, I mean, it was a pleasure to engage in this work. Gene, I think your mic may be off.
So the question is, what is leadership in this kind of new world that we have inherited and created? And this is our definition, but it is a bit different than what you may have read in other contexts. I'd just like to point a couple of things out here. It's enabling a learning community, and we use this phrase deliberately, learning community, instead of a school or a district. And the reason for that is that, you know, in this new world, we're going to have to define learning in many different ways, and there are going to be many different institutions engaged in that, and there's going to have to be much more collaborative interaction than there has been in the past. And education is not the sole purview of a school. We still will have schools, we'll still have districts, but I think we'll begin to redefine them. And learning community sort of captures this idea of a group of individuals with targeted responsibilities of being the locus of this work. And we use the word transform here deliberately because we are not convinced that simply fixing what we have or incrementally moving forward is going to suffice in the future. Second point I would make on this is that we define leadership as a team enterprise, not that of a single individual. Of course, there are individuals who have assigned responsibility or leadership roles, but we see leadership as a set of complementary folks who have a mix of knowledge, of skills and dispositions, and contextual understandings being brought together as a team to bring this about. And so that has direct influence on those people who have a responsibility. And then I think the last point I would make on this is that this is not a short-term enterprise, that we're going to have to sustain this work, this continuous improvement process of transformation over a long enough time that new behaviors emerge, that new systems take place, new structures replace old structures. And you can't do this overnight. You can't do it by mandate. It takes a lot of very hard and tedious work in order to bring it about. And then I think there are a number of conditions that I'm going to ask Jim to talk about that ought to be in place now that we need to begin to think about. And we did a lot of background search here, a lot of consultation with a number of folks, and we do think there are a number of conditions that ought to exist in a really vibrant learning community that don't exist in many places today. And Jim's going to walk through those, and without this sort of context to our work, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense about where we're going. So, Jim, I'll just turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Gene. Yeah, I think one of the things that, just as you were speaking, that occurs to me is that's important for us to remember is that as leaders, teams, as people who are engaging in leadership activities, our challenge is to create the set of conditions where change is more likely than not. The days are gone when we could simply mandate, if they ever were here, that this work is about creating this constellation of conditions that make change something that is more likely to happen than not. And it's based on, I think, a different framework for accountability than we have thought about in the past and we've experienced, and that is this idea, Michael Fulling talks about internal accountability versus external. And he says, internal accountability are the promises we make to each other about the work we're going to do. And that in that context, external information, data, is used in the context of what we've already promised and what we're already committed to doing. That external accountability, in the absence of internal accountability, ends up sort of distracting and in some cases creating perverse outcomes, because if we've not made the internal promises, we tend to respond disproportionately to expectations from somewhere else that may not share our values, may not share our conditions. And so part of this work is building this sort of internal set of promises to each other. And there are a number of conditions that seem to contribute to that in this context. For example, just this idea that learning is the work of everyone in the organization. And that means learners, that is our younger learners, but our adult professional learners also need to be learners as part of this work. And that there's clarity about what we're trying to do, so that even in the middle of ambiguity, people within the organization don't have to go to leaders all the time or people in formal positions of leadership to get clarity, because we know what we're about. And that we understand that it's a learning process, that the whole idea of missteps and mistakes are natural and healthy parts of the process moving forward. And the idea here is that these conditions are not in silos. They're not disconnected. They're part of this sort of, if you will, orbiting force around the work that we're trying to do that makes change more likely, more supported, and ultimately creates momentum attached to it. I think the whole idea of thinking about learning a little differently than our legacy system. Our legacy system sort of works on the assumption that learning is an outside-in process. That is, learning only happens if there's instruction. Well, we know that learning actually starts where the learner is. If we're preparing learners for a future that we can't predict, the best we can do is develop the capacity of learners to learn and instill in them an inclination to do so, because that's the secret to success. So as we think about these conditions, working our way through kind of what are the forces we need to put in place that will support the sort of change that prepares us for the kinds of challenges we face today that Jean talked about earlier, and that creates the capacity in our learners to be successful in the future. So without going to each of those in detail, there's certainly even more behind each of those than is in the paper. The concept here is that from a leadership perspective, this is more than issuing a mandate or putting out a memo. This is about every day working to create conditions that support the organization and the people within it to do the work that we're charged to do. And I'll look forward to your questions on this, because this is an area that's rich for discussion.
Those participating, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat room, or you can raise your hand on the platform here for Collaborate. We don't have any questions so far, Jim and Jean. I didn't know if you wanted to keep going. I can jump in when we have questions. Okay. There haven't been any questions in the chat room. We welcome everyone's questions, and I'll be happy to jump in and make sure that they get addressed. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Or Susan, I appreciate that very much. The couple of other thoughts on this vibrant learning community. There's been a lot of learning, a lot of it outside the United States that we've applied to these definitions that you see in the paper. And it would be wise for us to take advantage of what's popping up, both in from folks internationally, but in the United States. And what we're finding is that we're coming together pretty well around these set of conditions that are going to lead folks forward. So you'll notice in those that they're really process kinds of activities in many cases, but they're really anchored in this issue of all children learning at very high levels, and that this equity agenda becomes critical to the future of public education in this country. We've not been successful yet at reaching these high and lofty goals for all children. That ought to be at the center of every educator's mind right now, and beginning to figure out ways to do this. And this idea of building the kind of environment that we need is so important. The next piece that Jim's going to talk a bit about is this idea of what we did in the paper. We tried to resist the temptation of prescribing a set of skills. As we looked at a lot of the work around the country and the world, there were some assumptions that seemed to be behind them. One is that if only all people could learn to apply the same set of skills, we would improve leadership functioning. Second one was that if we could just begin to apply all of these conditions to all administrators, regardless of where they are and the role they carry out, we would be just fine. And so what we see in many cases is our leadership preparation programs that are predefined around primarily the functions that one performs. And when we see the kinds of supports and accountability structures around leaders, we see them being reinforced as they apply their work. So what came to us is that the real hard work of defining what leaders do in schools and districts is really a combination of forces. And it is important that there's a body of knowledge that we can identify that folks must possess, that there are certain skills that one must possess, and those are a bit different than historic roles that leaders have assumed. And there are certain ways of acting and dispositions and openness to these new roles and functions that must exist. But also this idea of context is so important, that you cannot apply the knowledge, skills, dispositions without context. This interplay between all of these is so important, and for anyone to prescribe a certain set of conditions for all would be error for us. So we provided here what we now know as some research and from practice what could be some knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and we provided an exemplar there about what a district would do. So it is this delicate balance of trying to bring this forward in a way that each person is held accountable for the knowledge, skills, and dispositions as they apply to the job, but within the contextual understanding. So Jim, I'll turn this over to you for amplification.
Sure. Thanks, Gene. Again, I think we can't overstate the importance of paying attention to context. As I think about my career, moving from position to position over time or from location to location, one of the things that became starkly clear is the things that I could assume about what I was doing before or where I was working before can't necessarily be transferred into a new context. In fact, some of the things that I may have assumed worked really well where I was in the past would turn out not to have much traction, or in some cases even garnered resistance in a new context. And it wasn't that the strategy was bad or the skill wasn't important. It was that it needed to be applied within the context of the history and the culture of where I was. And that, I think, is an experience that leaders probably share over time. Well, now thinking about trying to transform an organization, that's a new context also that we need to keep in mind as we try to apply our skills, as we try to position for leadership. This idea of understanding context is critical. And I think often it's ignored, and Gina, as you point out, sometimes even left completely off the list, when in fact, if we're going to transform that organization begins the transformation where it is, in the same way that learners begin learning where they are. And if, as leaders, we lead as though the organization is where we want them to be, we do that, I think, to our folly. So as we put together the exemplars of these sort of dimensions, and as Jean points out, these are exemplars. They're not intended to be all-encompassing. They're as much as anything intended to start thinking, to generate questions. But sort of across this idea of how do we build a shared vision, and how do we position ourselves as leaders? What do we need to know about the context of that community or that learning community in order to understand how to get started, where we need to put pressure, where we need to give encouragement, where we need to highlight, what we need to let go for a while in order to make it work. The same is true in terms of values. What do they value, and how do I position myself? What's the history of sort of shared values within the community, and what do we need to examine? What are the assumptions that we need to pull to the surface in order for us to move forward? Similarly with culture, there are a set of skills necessary to nurture and reinforce culture and even to change it. But if you don't understand the culture that's there, you don't understand the capacity that it has, we do it at our risk. And similar then with the other areas of capacity building accountability and trust, that each of these have multi-dimensions to them. And that from a leadership team perspective, are taking the time to understand context and then use that context to help us position our leadership and apply the skills we have are really critical to the sort of success of moving beyond just getting a little bit better. If we want people to get a lot better, if we want to redesign and take a new approach, we need to consider context. We need to be sure our leadership positioning is appropriate as we apply the skills we have and know that make a difference.
Thanks, Jim and Jean. This is Susan, and we have a comment and two questions, or two-part question from Barbara Tracy, who says, I love the paper. I've been thinking about the comment about the importance of moving ahead with deliberation versus not getting too far ahead of the community. What suggestions do you have for how leaders negotiate this tension? Are there some legacy activities that you think will be the hardest for learning communities to stop doing?
I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things we often forget in change is that it's not only the new things we do, it's also the things we leave behind. And I think among the most challenging things to leave behind are the assumptions we make that we grew up with as experiences that can hold us back. And I think one of the examples I would give is our legacy system is based on a concept of compliance, that people are told what to do, they're told when to do it, they're told how to do it, how long they're supposed to do it. And that, by the way, ironically, is an assumption that says if we didn't force them to comply, what we're asking them to do may not have enough value that they would choose to do it. And I think that letting go of compliance and shifting our focus to help people see purpose and value and make a commitment is one of the challenges, and it's a critical one for us to help people make. But it's also a really hopeful and respectful one as we start to move forward. So that's one that comes to mind. Gene, do you have others that you'd highlight?
Yeah, just on that first issue of how one might manage this, it seems to me that it's balancing a healthy respect for a community with a honest and important role that a leader has to lead and to help folks not equivocate from the overall responsibility we have for all children. So holding on to the mission and being clear about that mission, pulling people back to that mission constantly while engaging. I do not believe that we should eliminate tension. In fact, I think leaders in the future are going to have to be able to approach tension in a very positive light. Tension often is seen as negative and is avoided or leads to a confrontational kind of interaction with folks. And I think leaders are going to have to develop the skill of taking those differences, defining them clearly, engaging folks in good conversations, listening as much as talking to people in the community, yet as you do so and educate people, show that you're open to the change. You may have to change some of your ideas about how things are done. I think the area where leaders are going to have to hold on desperately is that we can't, in this process of defining what we're doing and how we're doing it, we can't back away from the real issues that are facing us as a society and the need for us to hold on to this role of educating at very high levels that prepare students for college career and civic life, as well as making sure that no student is left out of this equation. So I think this is a wonderful question, and it leads to that last conversation that Jim and I had about how one begins to marry context with knowledge, skills, and dispositions. I think on the legacy activities, I think there are numerous. One is simply that who is a leader has to change. There's this sort of hierarchy of leadership that we've assumed, and we often equivocate, we often back away, and we wait for a leader to define a direction and not become engaged directly in becoming leaders ourselves. A healthy learning community is one where multiple leaders are contributing in ways that they can and where their strengths are, and they're learning from others and they're gaining skill from the expertise that others have. So it's a much different interactive process that we're going to have to overcome. The second for me is this issue of educator development. We have too long done things to teachers, asked them to carry out others' ideas and responsibilities that they had very little to do with in terms of development. We've treated teachers as consumers and not producers of knowledge. And I think in the future world, we're going to have to rely much more heavily on those teachers to be the center of idea generation, development and testing and learning from each other and becoming much more of a shared community. And then finally, I think there are just some practical things that people are holding on to. Like, go to your community, for example, and ask them to question the grading system that's in place. Ask them to think about students learning at different times and teachers and students interacting with each other in different ways, or using other kinds of resources in the community for accrediting learning. So those are just things that we have assumed are real and need no questioning, when in reality there's a lot of serious concerns, and I would say a lot of resistance to challenging some of those inherited actions that are going on in communities.
You know, Gina, it strikes me as you were speaking, there actually probably is a way of thinking about pace. I think the things you were talking about in terms of paying attention to are really critical. But the in terms of pace of change, I think we can borrow from Vygotsky's zone of proximal development for learners in the context of just saying the best place for learning is where you must focus, where you've got to dedicate your energy, where you have to persist, but you can see the possibility of success on the other end. So if you're getting everything right, the pace probably isn't fast enough. If you're not making some mistakes, if you're not reaching some points of confusion or some tension, you're probably not moving fast enough. On the other hand, if it looks like the goal is getting farther away, people are starting to lose track of where they're trying to be, that we're getting too far out ahead, then we need to slow it down and back it up a little bit. But that there's a zone, I think, in terms of the pace of change that includes tension and mistakes at some level, but not so many and not so far off that people can't see and can't connect to it. But somewhere in that middle, from a leadership perspective, I think is the pace that makes most sense.
Obviously, we've not covered everything that's in that paper. I would encourage all of you to read it in detail, but we did this because we were concerned, and we think there is application of these ideas to the context in which you're operating, and so I would hope that there is some meaning in this for folks who are at a school level, people who are responsible for managing a district, and I think there are applications here for state education agencies also. So what we'd like to do, Susan, is to sort of engage people in some questions or interact with you around some of the ideas we presented or parts of the paper that we've not addressed at this point with the remainder of time that we have.
Great, thanks, Gene. And what you're describing is resonating a lot as we've examined not only some of the education systems at the local level, schools, networks of schools, individual schools around the U.S. that are really thinking differently around what's possible for student learning and how we create these new designs for student success. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is happening globally, and I've been struck by really what a different conversation there is in many different systems pushing this path forward around, you focused on context, and one of the things that a lot of traditional leadership programs don't necessarily spend a lot of time on, but is this idea around context. Another one is around culture and the massive change in culture itself and belief systems towards a growth mindset that's needed to create transformational models. I'd love to hear from those that are attending some of your thoughts today. What other ideas around leadership would you like to, what are you thinking about? What would you do and address? One of the questions I had, Gene, was when you talk about their new roles for state departments of ed, they're really in charge of licensing our teachers and coming up with a certification policy. So what do we think about, what does this mean for credentialing, or is there a path forward that might look different than the way we do things today?
You've raised such an important issue. My general sense is that if these learning communities were to emerge and become the kind of continuous improvement entities that we're talking about, they would still be running up against state bureaucracies that will, at best, cause them to have to work around. At worst, that would inhibit the work that they're undertaking. And one area of great importance here is what would this look like in a state that really embraces this idea that they're going to support these dynamic learning communities, and they're going to build off of that. So these learning communities in that state, in my mind, would be the starting point and the central locus of all the work that goes on to support them. And so I could see much richer data systems in place from a state level that would allow these learning communities to glean knowledge from their own work, that is, how well their students are doing against their learning goals, but also supplying them with the knowledge base that's coming out of the collective action of these learning communities across the state and nation, as well as inputting really important knowledge that's being acquired across the world in front of these teachers to make decisions. But from that kind of information base and support structure, I could see these learning communities being a way in which teachers design their own learning opportunities in the future, but it would be in the context of the learning community, so that individual teachers would be setting goals, developing hypotheses about, if I learn this or I use these materials in different ways, then that becomes the professional growth plan for that teacher. And it's always in the context of that learning community, so teachers might be doing some individual work, but they would be coming together as a community to talk about collective learning, and that would be the way in which they would apply external resources to their work, and that would be the way in which they would be advanced financially. That would be the way in which they are recognized. There would be differentiated roles that teachers would play in this process. So I could see schools contracting with external agents for their own personal growth, that what one school is doing would be different than what another school is doing or another district is doing. But a state would then have to recognize that, Susan, as a way in which they credential learning, recognize learning, and that's not the way in which it occurs today. Most places still rely on teachers going out individually without connections to their community, learning from external agents who pre-design learning programs, who sanction them in a way that is consistent no matter where you're going. All people going for this certification have the same experiences and so forth, and it is not directly connected to the day-to-day activities. How do we find time at a state level to reward this kind of a process? So I hope I give you a sense that I don't see this as a small shift or one or two things that a state can do. It's sort of stepping back and rethinking what kind of environment would we create that would build off of these learning communities.
You know, Jim, I think you're so right. In fact, it occurs to me that the evolution of this process as it starts to play out probably argues for different roles or expanded roles for teachers than we think about today. A few years ago, KnowledgeWorks did, I think, some really good work to try and think about different roles within education, that it's not, teacher isn't this all-encompassing, this is the role you have, that there are many roles that could and should be played within schools. In fact, I think even in terms of the credentialing around disciplines, that increasingly that focus needs to become the structure of the discipline, what's the nature of the discipline, and not just what's the content of the discipline. In fact, in many ways, I think there's a parallel in what you described and what we're trying to do for our young learners. And in many ways, the kinds of things we're trying to do for our youngest learners in classrooms around their learning needs to be applied to adults. The whole idea of autonomy, that there's purposefulness to the work, that there's support and collaboration for the work. These really important elements. And in many ways, it seems ridiculous for us to expect adults to change behavior in terms of how they engage our youngest learners if we're unwilling or unable to do the same thing for them.
Jim and Jean, just thinking about the work that you've been engaged with, actually with districts, working on innovative practices around the country, and thinking about, Jim, the work that you've done at the Institute for Personalized Learning. There are a couple of different things that make this such an important period of time to really start grappling with and moving forward on this big shift. One is that the new federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act that was passed in December of now 2015, but removes the highly qualified teacher provision. So it really unfreezes the system more than it has been in a long time for states to rethink not just sort of seat time, content-focused certifications and licensure to more skills-based, competency-based, and what you were describing, Jane, as rethinking it. And in Wisconsin, with the Institute and several districts there, with several of the other districts you've been working with in the states that are working in the Innovation Lab Network, can you share some specific insights or districts that might serve as exemplars for this kind of shift? Maybe there are some that are shifting to micro-credentials or others. But can you give some examples of where this is happening?
Absolutely, Susan. I could give you a bunch. Let me start with just one. I think that's a really good exemplar, and that's the Kettle Moraine School District. Some of the people on this call may be familiar with it, but they have really moved in the direction of positioning educators to set goals, to plan paths, to build their own expertise. And one of the key strategies has been the idea of micro-credentials. And you might think of micro-credentials as badges, or they're just this idea that rather than the sort of broad umbrella of a credit or a college credit that may or may not be relevant, to really look at the specific skills and pieces of knowledge, capacities that people might focus on. So they use some outside agencies that do micro-credentialing, but there's also an opportunity for people internally to say, this is a skill that I would like to learn. They have a structure within the district that includes a diverse committee that sort of approves and monitors the process, but individual teachers can propose micro-credentials or processes that they want to engage in terms of their own learning. And what's interesting about that is, one, that it's completely relevant, and two, that often it includes giving back to the organization. So having learned a skill or having developed a process or a concept, they're often then engaged in teaching others what they've learned. So you're building not just the capacity of the individual, but you're building the capacity of the organization overall. And I think particularly innovative attached to this is those micro-credentials, those learning elements also factor into compensation. So it's not just a good thing to do, it's also highly valued. In our society, we value with money. And so in the Kettle Moraine system, as people move forward with their with micro-learning, they're also building their own compensation related to it. So I think that's a really good model. If people are looking for one to study, I think Kettle Moraine may be out in front around that, and there are other really great examples, but I think that's one that captures what Jean was saying really pretty well.
Thanks, Jim. Jean, I didn't know if you had other exemplars or examples of districts that you've been working with that are starting to provide some examples.
We've been working with that have begun to operate in this way, and I was with one yesterday in Virginia where that district has spent considerable time in community conversations about what they're calling a portrait of a graduate for their community, and that means a lot of conversation, a lot of interaction with folks to get to a point of understanding and agreement about what they want for their children in the future. But I also see those districts as investing heavily in their teachers and giving those teachers autonomy, as Jim was saying, and responsibility to take leadership roles, redefining the role of principalship and redirecting the district resources to be a supporter of those local schools and treating them a bit differently. So they're systematically thinking about ways in which they can make a vision real and build the capacity of the folks inside the system to carry that out.
Great. There's a comment from Sharon and a question from Liz Loa that I will pose. Sharon's comment, it says, it seems like a key is the empowering of teams, individuals, and moving away from centralized control. And I think we've definitely seen that as a theme. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that, and I'll go to Liz's question.
I make just one comment about it, and that is the way we've organized in the past with the sort of idea of central control has created this sort of sense of scarcity around power, around influence, around ability to make a difference. And that by bringing teams in, by distributing the sort of opportunities for leadership, in many ways we're creating a variety of paths, a variety of opportunities that now begins to create this sort of abundance of possibility, not this absolute competition for power and position. And so I think in many ways what's happening is that without necessarily expanding the budget, we're expanding possibilities and we're growing organizations where there's an opportunity for anybody and everybody to play a critical role, that you don't have to be in a position with a title in order to make a difference. I think that's really important in the work we're doing here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's a lot rests in the minds of the leaders, designated leaders. They've got to be willing to let go of control and invest faith and trust in folks that they can be leaders also. But you know, we often confuse this idea of as we move forward. I sort of look at it as a continuum. Some administrators are listening, and they consider that to be a way to empower folks. Some of them are involving them in tasks, but those tasks are predefined and the conditions are predetermined. And some of them are engaging, but we're really talking about agency here, and finding ways for teachers and students to exemplify this idea of controlling their own lives, taking responsibility for their role in the system as learners and as instructors and as teachers, and allowing that agency to grow, even though at times there will be some falling back, but supporting them when they do so. And that gets back to one of the conditions that Jim mentioned earlier in the presentation, that is that in this kind of environment, you're going to take reasoned risk, but the worst thing one can do in that kind of a situation is to clamp down or shut down the learning process that's going on. So it's a very different definition and understanding of what leadership is, beginning to build this so that the entire learning community sees themselves as having control of their own lives.
Yeah, the point about the hierarchy in our learning environments or in our schools and our structures is an important one, and this shift to empower others on educator agency and learner agency, where everyone's becoming an activated agent driving their own learning, adults as well as students and our young people across the system. It's a significant shift, but it's so important for this distributed leadership to be able to activate in positive ways to make this change happen. I'll go to Liz Loa's question. She asks, you have mentioned that this is for transformational change in learning communities and is context-based. If a learning community is deeply divided and is not in agreement on the mission, what aspects of leadership do you think must come into play in order to move things forward?
Well, this is a wonderful challenge for the design that we laid out, and I think you apply all three of those aspects to that situation. you've got a divided community. I think it's going to require contextual understanding as well as some sort of disposition as you approach that divided community, and a set of skills as you walk them through that process of moving in a constructive way into the future. But I think on the contextual understanding, they're divided for a number of reasons. I think what it would take, first of all, is understand that these people are coming to the table with certain histories and certain backgrounds, and obviously making very different conclusions about what is important for the school system. And I think it's also understanding that many people see change in a threatening way. And you're going to have to help people walk through that to reach a point of willingness to look at. And one of the things that I've found to be really meaningful is a deep community conversations about what we want our students to know, be able to do, and understand. I've witnessed a number of these, facilitated a number of them. They've been environments where we just opened that question, or we stimulated it with outside people sort of laying out a context of the community and the world today. But I have never seen it fail that when you say, what do you want for your children, a community begins to come together. And I think that kind of deep conversation, open forum, and lots of feedback to the community about what they're saying and where they're going, if you can get to that point, and I think you can, of a general understanding of what we value and what we want for our students, and keep anchoring back in that as you move forward, it becomes a point of positive development over time. But I think, again, the disposition chair are ones where you're going to have to trust that people are coming to the table in good faith. You're going to have to be open to differences being expressed, being confident that you can take those and think systematically about what these folks are saying and bring it back to them in a way that they can understand, see themselves, and see a future that's positive. And of course, this is not an easy conversation to have, but I think often these kinds of divided communities have not had that opportunity to engage in these serious conversations and to come together around agreement about where they want to go. I think after you do that, then the steps to get there are a lot easier than they would be without that understanding.
I think you're absolutely right, Gene. I think it's interesting that disproportionately divisions are about adult agendas. And if we can come together about what we want for our youngest learners and our collective future, it's a lot easier to pull together. And then around that, and I think you spoke to the conditions of trust and openness and willingness to listen and to respect each other, we can get there. But it's hard to get there if we start with the adult agendas. We just dig in more tightly. But if we could step back from that and say, okay, let's just talk about what we want for our learners, and what does that mean in terms of the future we're trying to prepare them for. That there turns out that there's a lot more that we agree on than we disagree about.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
It's interesting also. Linda and I have had a number of, Linda Pittenger and I have had a number of conversations with communities about this, and it is really intriguing that often they will expand the definition of learning beyond what we have traditionally thought they would say. They very quickly get to these kinds of what we would call life skills, important opportunities that and kind of ways of learning that often we don't think they feel are important, but we hear the idea of contributing members of the community, students who can persist against difficult times, people who can cooperate and yet take individual responsibility. Those things begin to emerge, and those are going to lay challenges on the educators about okay, what are we going to do systematically and in a targeted way to make sure our students have those attributes as well as learning mathematics and English language arts and sciences?
Thank you. That's a wonderful point to really important point to wrap up on. And just to make a note of, Don Savitsky has a great comment here too, saying he's participated in 20 plus of these community conversations, and 9 out of the top 10 attributes that were requested for their children, their communities, and our learners were affective rather than cognitive. I think that's a really important point to drive home, and I'm going to bring it back again to the fact that we have a new federal law in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which actually asks communities to rethink what their profile of a learner, what students need to know and be able to do for the whole child, and for a broader set of skills and dispositions. Some people call it redefining what student success looks like, but it's the heart of the issue we were just talking about. And it's an opportunity for stakeholders to engage deeply in the conversations and communities with our learning environments in our schools and our systems. So just to wrap up, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your leadership on this important issue, Jean, Linda, and Jim. And I just want to thank so many of you who have participated in this webinar today for the important work towards transformation that you're engaged in. Please let us know what we can do to help at iNACOL, and just final word of thanks to the Center for Innovation in Education and all of your work with the Institute for Personalized Learning. Thank you, and this is the beginning of really important conversations of transforming learning across this country and across the world. So we look forward to staying in touch, and let us know what we can do to help. Thanks again. Bye-bye.